T-minus 17 seconds and counting. 15, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Go for main engine start. Main engine start. 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery, returning to the space station, paving the way for future missions beyond.
Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to another conversation sheltered in place. I hope everybody's doing well and navigating the crisis known as 2020. I'm really excited about our conversation today. I've become convinced, and I know my guest believes this as well, that we are in the midst of the great transition, and we have an opportunity through the challenges that we're facing right now to come out the other side and not go back to the status quo, but go back to something different, something better. And so like I said, I'm really excited about today's fellow converser, and it's Danielle Kayembe. And she's one of the most insightful people I know, and she's really in tune with trends and really in tune with what's going on right now. And I think this is going to be a really exciting and really fruitful conversation. Danielle is a futurist and a serial entrepreneur who works on projects at the intersection of women tech and social impact. Through her company Greyfire, she advises female founders in the US and emerging markets in Africa on scaling their businesses and raising capital. Danielle is an advisor to social impact startups and a mentor to Columbia University's Business Accelerator. She has lectured at Yale, Barnard, Princeton universities. Danielle is also a Rothschild Fellow, and this is an award that recognizes the top 20 global social impact entrepreneurs each year. She has been featured on CNBC and in Forbes, and is a frequent speaker at the United Nations, TEDx, Google, General Assembly, and other events. Danielle is also the author of The Silent Rise of the Female-Driven Economy. And this is a position paper on women and the future of business and innovation. And this was published in an article on Refinery 21 that went viral. It's a great read. I highly recommend it. We put the link to the article in the comments. Like I said, I think everybody should read it. And with that, I hope everyone please welcome to Conversation Sheltered in Place, Danielle Kayembe. Hey, Danielle, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Ron.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I want to remind everybody that give us your comments, bring your questions. Thanks to everybody who's tuning in. I see people coming in from all over. And again, this is not just a conversation between two people. It's a conversation with all of us. You're all part of this conversation, so jump in. So Danielle, why don't we just start up by, not everybody might know who you are and what your background is. Can you share a little bit of that?
Sure. So I was originally born in the Congo, so the Democratic Republic of Congo, and my family immigrated to the US when I was 5. Most of my kind of career and early work was really in the business space. So I started out as an investment banker. I did $25 billion in deals on Wall Street and burned out, like many people would if you're working as much as that would require.
Bringing all that money in sounds like it would burn you out.
It would.
I'd hate to have that happen to me.
Well, not to me personally. So, I decided to take a break. And in that time, I actually started doing work in Africa. And I got really inspired by the idea of seeing how the work I was doing there, which were, I was doing deals that were the same size as the deals I was doing in the US on Wall Street, but I could see the direct impact on the communities. So I could see, lights going up, I could see markets and women get more empowered and people become more active and roads go in. And so I started really questioning myself, how can I take the skills that I have and use them to create greater impact? And so as I was doing that, I started to see that as I was looking at how I could be the most effective, there were all of these big global challenges. whether it was environment, education, healthcare. But when you looked at all of the solution sets, you saw that the common denominator was actually empowering women across every major global challenge. And so I dedicated myself to saying, hey, I'm going to focus on how I can empower women. And so a lot of the work I've done has been supporting female entrepreneurs or social impact entrepreneurs, both on the continent and also in the US. And through doing that work, I started to see these synchronicities. So I started to see that there was a very specific type of innovation that women were doing that no one was really talking about. And that led me to essentially write my article and talk about the importance of design in creating access and in driving new types of innovation.
Right. And I mean, your focus of your work is on gender equity and empowering women. And that's why, to honor that, I wore this shirt today. Can you see that?
Yes, Satoshi.
So what does that mean? What does that t-shirt mean to you?
So I actually watched someone give a talk about blockchain yesterday, and they said that, the founder of blockchain, he did X, Y, or Z. And the truth is that the founder is anonymous. So no one actually knows who the founder is. And so the values espoused in blockchain, which are actually focused on creating trust, bridging communities, allowing people to, make contact and interact with each other free from borders. And it felt like a much more universal concept, I think, than, and probably in some ways transcends gender. And so right. I think Satoshi is female is an attempt to really make that more universal and more welcoming, especially to women. So my friend Nyla Rogers, who I think you know as well, has really been leading that discussion, and I wholly support it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's all those things that you mentioned, those aspects of blockchain, which all those aspects of a distributed information system, right? That democratizes information, that basically does things like potentially making corruption obsolete and things like that. It's a tool that levels the playing field. It seems like it's more likely that a system like that would be designed by a female than a male. So I think it's more welcoming as well, but I think there might be some truth to that as well. So we met at the UN. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Did we actually meet at the UN, or did we meet at the screening of Planetary? Was that, I think, or the UN?
Both. I know we were in both rooms for sure.
Yeah. But our most recent time together was right before the pandemic hit. We were in Davos together, and we had a wonderful rooftop conversation. Yeah. And we were talking about the potential of having a big transition or a great transition. And this is before we even knew any of the stuff that was about to happen. We had no clue that any of that was happening. I mean, there was already, in China, the pandemic was starting. It was just starting to get, some of the echoes of or the reverberations of what was going on. But I don't think anybody had a clue what was about to happen. But I just remember that, star-filled night, up on the rooftop, talking about all this, and a lot of what we talked about is actually coming to fruition. So let's jump right in. Let's just talk about what we think is going on here. What do you think is going on here?
Yeah.
Is there more to this than meets the eye?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that this is ultimately like it is a great transition, and I loved when you sent me that this was the title of today's talk, because I think that the things that are happening are so big, and they hit both on a global scale and on a personal scale. And so I think we're not having those conversations where we're stepping back and looking at, what is really happening and how is this affecting us. So I think this is so valuable that you're creating the space for that. I feel like the way that I look at it, and I love being able to have this conversation with you, COVID, in a lot of ways, having this global pandemic, and then, now we're kind of in, a domestic revolution, for lack of a better word. It's really a testing ground for how we collectively address the global challenges that we are facing, and I think in a lot of ways, COVID is revealing so much of what is not okay, but it's also just showing us, I think it's a precursor, right? So many of the challenges, the large challenges that we face as a global community, things like climate change, for example. I mean, these are things that affect all of us, obviously personally, but essentially we have to respond as a global community. And I think COVID is revealing the ways that we're not equipped to do that. But I think this is the first of probably many challenges that we have to take on and find new ways to address that we haven't been able to do as a collective before.
Yeah, I think, you bring out a really, really good point. And I think part of the status quo I was talking about is right now the default. Well, you talk about the default in design being male, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But the default in the problem solving realm is usually national, right? So usually we think of terms of problems and challenges in terms of our nation, right?
Yeah.
And our loyalty goes towards our own particular flag, our own particular nation. One of the interesting things that has evolved is multinational corporations, and so now that span borders, right? Now the loyalty goes to the shareholders, right? So we move from national to global, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that although that does allow us to have collaboration that crosses borders, it just changes the loyalty from a flag to a shareholder report, right? And that's what global is all about. And part of the old status quo that I think needs to change is the best we can do right now is global. To attack our problems globally, that's the best we can do. We need to attack them planetary, not global, because when you attack them from a planetary point of view, the ultimate loyalty doesn't go to the shareholder. The ultimate loyalty goes to the continuance of our species and the continuance of all the species on our planet, and protecting the biosphere and the life support systems of our planet. And I think that's a really important thing. How does that resonate with you, and what you've seen in your entrepreneurship?
I think that's so important, because I think you bring a really specific perspective that obviously very few people on the planet have, right? Of seeing the ways that we are interconnected, right? The ways that we are actually all on this collective journey together. And I think that brings a different element to the conversation, because it changes what's at stake. And I think we've all been kind of trained to look at things from a really binary perspective, right? And it's so hard, I think, to get out of that. I think that in the entrepreneurship space, where you see the most innovation towards that is probably what, represented by the shirt that you're wearing, right? I think blockchain, actually, the innovation that you see there is actually all about transparency. It's all about redistribution. It's all about putting power and I think collective responsibility back in the hands of the individuals, and really kind of putting everyone back at the same level. And I feel like there's something really powerful about how, blockchain has a potential to transform how we operate outside of this broken systems that we're in right now. And in some ways, does blockchain represent the fact that maybe we actually are rapidly evolving in some ways, right? Like these technologies are reflecting us as opposed to the other way around.
We're having some growing pains.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. So Thomas Dolores brought out private equity should be mentioned along with shareholders. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that. Maybe you have a better read on that. as far as
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of activity in venture capital and private equity that we are starting to see some of the largest players in that space start to focus specifically on impact and start to allocate dollars not only based on collective global challenges, but also based on kind of almost like a new moral code. So I think the chairman of I think it's BlackRock, one of the largest private equity companies, came forward and essentially said that they were going to, allocate their considerable holdings with a focus on social impact and climate change and specific principles going forward, which I think really sent positive shockwaves through that industry, that there would really be kind of a new approach. And you're seeing a lot of the same thing in the venture capital space, where a lot of the largest investors in early stage companies are now making large bets in climate change and tech that impacts and supports that.
Yeah, I think you probably agree with this. I believe that business enterprise has the incredible power to either destroy our world by clinging to the old way of doing things, the two-dimensional winner at all costs, competition, conquest, profit maximization at all costs, or it has the power to save our world by embracing a new way of doing things like you talk about. And finance is the rocket fuel of business enterprise. And so one of the root causes of the problems that we face is the way that capital and investment is flowing around the world and what it's flowing towards. And we really need to be careful. Not only do we have to recycle plastic, we need to keep track of where our investment dollars are going and what they're going to invest in. And I think you and I have both spoken at the UN on this topic of trying to steer investment towards the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but towards triple bottom line products or projects and ESG and everything else. And again, we're not going to, unless we hit the root cause problems, we're not going to do more than slap band-aids on things. So.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a movement towards greater accountability. I think that we're even starting to see, in the UK, they're looking at, placing legislation that companies that are not focused on ESG may actually be delisted within the next few years. We're also seeing legislation in, I think, California, France, and a handful of other countries. I think definitely kind of Norway and some of those places where you have to have female representation on your board. So I think that we are seeing some of these things, some of these types of accountability become the norm and become the expectation that, yes, as a company, you have a responsibility. But again, I would say I don't know how closely you're following, but I've been really pleasantly surprised by the impact of not only COVID, but the Black Lives Matters protest. And there's been a tangible shift in what corporate responsibility means and what it means to be a good corporate citizen.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
I think hopefully we're moving out of the era where companies, had their corporate social responsibility offices, in a silo that, they allocated, a small fraction of the budget, where they spent more money advertising and, telling everybody about the good that they were doing than the actual good that they were doing.
Right.
We're seeing more and more companies where they're starting to write that into their DNA, right? And those are going to be the successful companies of the near future, not the far future, the near future. Those companies, because people have had enough. They've had enough of big corporations taking advantage of people, taking advantage of the environment, taking advantage of society, and feeding off society for that matter. And they're starting through their pocketbooks, to hold these companies accountable. And I think it's a good trend. It needs to continue and accelerate, though.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Unilever is one of the companies that's been a leader in really integrating, essentially SDGs and ESG into each individual brand. So you can actually go on their website, and Paul Pullman, I think, really kind of revolutionized a lot of this type of reporting. But you can see for each brand and business unit, what their commitments are to the environment, to the communities where they do business, to the communities that they sell their products to, and you can track their progress on a 10-year cycle. And I think other companies are starting to follow suit in terms of real transparency and accountability with the public. But I think that's what the public expects now, right? People are voting with their dollars much more than they ever were before.
Yeah, and I think there's two requirements for a business to move in the direction that Unilever did. One is you need strong leadership, and the other one is you need to take the focus off of the short term and put it more on the long term. So in Paul Pullman's case, he had the leadership to convince his board of directors and his shareholders that they need to play the long game, and they need to not worry, not be completely 100% focused on the next shareholder report, right? And to start seeing this bigger picture. So we have a note from M. Adam. Can COVID reset the agenda in African countries to necessitate change for the better, or will COVID create regression in these economies, specifically Congo? I just read like an hour ago, the DRC, along with the World Health Organization, announced that they just beat the latest Ebola pandemic that was going on there. So what do you think about that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. Africa is a really interesting case because Africa actually, 19 of the world's 20th youngest youth populations are actually in Africa. And so if you compare that to Asia, China, the US, Europe, these other, I think Western countries in Asia, they have anywhere from 30 to 40% of their population is actually over the age of 55, which is essentially the audience that's most at risk for COVID. And so part of the restrictions around COVID have been focused on, keeping people sheltering in place so that you essentially flatten the curve so that the health services are not flooded. However, in Africa, you don't have a healthy health care infrastructure, right? And you also have a population that's less likely to get COVID because of age and other factors. So it's been a little bit of a mix.
Less likely to get it or less likely to die from it?
Well, they may get it, but I think less likely to die or have, serious. They don't have the comorbidities that typically lead to like the need for hospitalization, more serious care. So it's been a mixed bag in terms of the impact in Africa. I think that's similar to Ebola. What you've seen is a reallocation of resources away from some of the existing challenges. So, for example, women are still having children even during COVID, right? Women who are pregnant are still need care. And so you have resources that are allocated away from basic types of care. And quite honestly, women are usually kind of the first to lose support when things like this happen. So you're seeing that. You're also seeing impact on things like trade, foreign direct investment, things like remittances. So there's, probably close to 50 billion in remittances, which is family that's abroad sending money back every month to relatives in Africa. So you're seeing kind of the impact of COVID in the West impacting, how that's translating to financial support for families there on the ground. And then obviously the big one is going to be tourism. You've seen tourism cut down significantly because people are not traveling in Europe, not traveling in Asia, not traveling in the US, and not feeling like they are safe to travel to Africa. So you're seeing some of those things as kind of the biggest impacts. But, I think the bright side is that because Africa's been wrestling with challenges like Ebola for the last several years, they have contact tracing protocols in place that Western countries don't have. So some of what we're seeing is that I think especially in places like South Africa, they're leveraging some of that mobile contact tracing in order to do that. They also have a jump on us in terms of things like mobile payments. So M-Pesa in Kenya, and it, for example, is extremely sophisticated form of mobile money that people use. And so things like that allow people to continue to trade, even if, they're now focusing more on home delivery than going into public places and exchanging goods.
Yeah. There's a lot we can learn from other countries right now. I mean, I just today I looked at the data, and it sure looks like we're turning in the wrong direction. It sure looks like the second wave is upon us, and we're starting to shoot back up again. And so, it's interesting. We talk about we're not going to go back to the status quo. There's going to be a lot of changes, and there's going to be some balancing acts that we're going to have to do. Like a lot of the stuff you're talking about, like contact tracing and stuff like that, has privacy implications, right? And there's a big outcry around the country right now about people, legislation that forces people to wear masks in public places, and how that infringes on their freedom. So there's a balancing act between individual freedoms and privacy and the overall good of society. So it's going to be a tough road to walk, I think, to figure out how to thread that needle.
Yeah, I don't know if I have I don't know if I have a horse in that game. I think that's a complicated situation, because I think the challenge is more about leadership, and I think there's been marked differences in types of leadership around the world that we've seen during COVID. I have friends that travel all over the world. My friends that have traveled to Korea, for example, have a very different travel arrival protocol than my friends do in the US. So I think that it's not about the masks or not the masks. For me, it's more about how are things communicated. Do people feel like they're cared for and being provided for? Do people feel like there's a sense of stability and clarity? I think that that's what's creating the anxiety that we're seeing people share.
I think it also stresses the need to make decisions and make policies based on the most accurate data that we have possible. And that brings to mind a quote by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he said, "We cannot succeed by denying what exists. The acceptance of reality is the only place from which change can begin." And so this applies to COVID. It applies to any problem that we're facing. Unless we start our problem-solving process from a foundation of reality, we're going to lead down to disaster. And that goes to your comments on leadership. And if we're sticking our head in the sand, which across the country right now, there's many leaders, both in our communities, in our states, and in the federal government, that are not doing much more than sticking our heads in the sand and just wishing it all away. And the other countries that are doing this successfully are taking the best data they have available. They're listening to the scientists, they're listening to the experts, and they're crafting out a plan. And again, they're concentrating on the long term, not the short term. And what that means is, if you concentrate solely on the short term and you base everything on the economy and getting the economy back right now, that could really backfire on you, because what's going to be needed to get the economy really on track and firing on all cylinders for the long term is getting rid of the virus. And so if we're not willing to take the medicine right now, then the patient could possibly die. So we have to get off the short-term thinking. We have to get off the refusal to listen to real data, and we need to start attacking this in a rational way.
I completely agree with you.
We're having this conversation.
I mean, I completely agree with you. Everyone has to have the same data and the same information, and I think there just needs to be greater transparency about what is or isn't accurate. I mean, I think you brought up the issue of masks earlier. I mean, we got multiple conflicting information about what to do or not to do, and so I think if that's happening on a person to person level, imagine the impact for someone who's trying to run a business or a corporation. So I think that there's no way to avoid there being some big systemic changes in the business world and other parts of our society as a result of what's happening. I think this is a historic moment. There's nothing like this that's happened on the planet for hundreds of years. So we're going to need a different type of leadership to navigate this, and a different type of perspective to make sense of this and result and to, I think, emerge from it better than we are now.
Yeah, I think the systemic change is what is needed at this moment in history, and hopefully this is the catalyst to make us want to do that, because it should be obvious to everybody that the status quo is not working. And when I say that, I don't mean the status quo isn't working for anybody. It's working for a few. It's not working for the vast majority of the folks. And until we have a status quo that works for everyone, we're not going to progress. We're not going to prosper. And one of the things that's obvious, I think, from this pandemic is that the saying "we're all in this together" is not a cliche. It's the reality of the world that we live in. And one of the analogies that has dawned on me, which is a translation, I think, of what I've seen, what I experience in space, and that is that we're a superorganism. We are not just us as humanity, but the entire planet and every living thing on it is a superorganism. And if you imagine, the body of this superorganism is the Earth, right? So the Earth itself is the skeleton, it's the structure, it's the foundation. The animals and the plants together, complementary, are the lungs of the planet. The river systems and the water cycle is the circulatory system, and then the body, the actual living organism, is all of the living things. And embedded within this superorganism is another superorganism, which serves as the brain, and that's the superorganism known as humanity. The problem is right now that the superorganism known as humanity is unconscious, and it doesn't operate in a manner that is in the best interest of the overall superbody, right? It reacts in reaction to its loudest parts. It reacts under animal instincts to benefit small segments. But until we realize that this is the reality of the world we live in, we're not going to be able to progress and prosper and solve the problems that we face. Again, we'll do nothing more than slap band-aids on things. We live in a deeply interconnected, interdependent world where you can't just look at one thing without considering everything else. Everything affects everything else. And with that, I hope we could segue back into the great transition conversation, because I know that you have some deep insights into that, on what's on, because I know we talked about it before all this stuff happened, that we were on the eve of something big, and neither one of us knew what that something big was. Now we do. It's called 2020. But how about some glimpses of hope? Do you see any glimpses of hope out there?
Yeah, I think that there's, one of the things I look at is I identify trends as a futurist, and I'm always kind of looking ahead. And one of the things that I see is that the younger generation, so Gen Z, I think of them as they fundamentally don't believe in duality, and that's something really, really interesting, right? Because if we look at everything in our world right now, it is all based on duality, right? So whether it's gender, whether it's race, power, whatever it is, right? Everything is essentially grounded, class. Exactly, everything is two-dimensional. And I think that there's some statistic that something like 86% of Gen Z doesn't believe in gender, right? Which is, right, which is mind-blowing, right? Compared to the generations that have come before it. And so they're kind of the first generation that we've tried to teach duality to, that refuse to buy into it, right? And so I think that as a result of that,
they're refusing their programming.
Yeah, they're refusing it. And I think that that's why, in a lot of ways, Gen Z are really the ones that are driving this shift, right? And I think that part of the reason it's been so systemic, and that we're seeing continued change and progress, right? Usually when we look at change, the last few hundred years, it's been really incremental, right? And we are all accustomed to that, right? Something goes wrong, people make an apology, and then, we take a couple steps forward, and then we take like 3 steps back. And we're all used to that cycle. It's very rare that we see changes to not only how do I describe it? So not only symbolic, but also like systemic structures, right? So symbolic would be things like, statues coming down, the impact in the media, right? So media really is what manages like our symbolism and narratives as a community, as a society. They write the stories that we all kind of share in. So we're seeing, this kind of roll through and impact media. And then we're also seeing changes at a systemic level, right? So we're seeing, changes in corporations, we're seeing changes in legislation, we're seeing changes in law enforcement, and conversations that we thought would take 100 years and would never be on the table are suddenly very rapidly part of our reality. And so, so for me, I think there's a hope that we're living in the world of the future, right? We're living in the world that's being shaped by the next generation that is going to shepherd this world forward. And they don't seem to be interested in waiting, right? Yeah. They seem to want these systemic and symbolic changes now, and I find that very hopeful. I find it very hopeful because the fact that they don't believe in duality, I think brings us so much closer to your vision. It brings us so much closer to really seeing real progress towards a world where there's greater equality and there's greater, there's more space for everyone to participate.
We are living in the world of the future. And the reason why we're living in the world of the future is because our minds are not catching up with it. Because for all of human history up until now, we tend to think linearly, right? So cause and effect, right, on a linear timeline. But, Moore's law for technology has demonstrated that things don't change necessarily on a linear scale. They change on an exponential scale. And really, if you look at nature, the rhythm of nature is exponential. Yeah. So, the virus is a perfect example. The virus doesn't spread linearly, it spreads exponentially. So the rhythm of nature is exponential, but our brains, the way we process, hasn't. So, we're just constantly trying to keep up with what's going on, and we get farther and farther behind. And so, I think one of the big things to think about is this fact that things can happen so fast, and they can happen overnight, and that's why in my new book I use a term called dolly zoom, right? And dolly zoom is a technique in cinematography where you zoom the camera, the lens in at the same time you roll the camera back, or vice versa. And I use that as a metaphor and an analogy throughout the book to talk about how we have to dolly zoom situations, right? And when we dolly zoom, we zoom out to the widest possible geographic perspective as we can. But as we do that, we don't lose the details of the worm's eye view from the ground, right? You can't zoom out to collective population of 8 billion people and cause everybody to turn into numbers and statistics. You have to also keep the individual people in view. But we also, at the same time, it's temporal. It's not just geographic, right? Or spatial. We have to look at the long-term effects of things without losing the short-term effects, right? They're both important. And so if we only focus on the long term, we're going to miss things because things are happening so fast because they're taking off exponentially. If we only think of the short term, then the course that we put ourselves on this exponential path could lead us to exponential bad or exponential good. So we have to keep both those in store. So I want to make another plug for everybody to send us your comments and questions and join this conversation. So defaults. So we talked about the default being national, or at best global, and the default should be planetary. In other words, to bring the biosphere of the planet into view. But you also talk about, especially in your article, about the default being male. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So I talk about a concept that I call coded patriarchy, which is just kind of this assumption that everything is designed for a male default, right? And it's something that we take for granted. And as a whole, women take it for granted that they're uncomfortable as they move about the world day to day because of this default. And it's not just women, obviously, right? It's anyone who has any type of a physical challenge, anyone who's differently abled, children, elderly people, right? There's a lot of people that are excluded when things are designed in a certain way. And so a lot of the really simple examples that I like to give really sprang I'll give a couple of really simple examples. So the one I always start with is doors. And because we all go in and out of doors every day. And one thing we never think about is that doors are actually designed for the tensile strength of an average man. And so a lot of times if you're going in and out of a corporate building, if you pay attention, you'll actually notice it's a little bit harder for women to open those doors or to push them open, even if they're revolving doors, right? And it's something that probably your average man has never thought about. Another simple example I like to give is mobile phones. So I'll flash my phone here. So phones are actually designed for men to use one-handed and fit in their pockets. And so because on average a woman's hand is about 2 centimeters shorter from across their hand to their thumb, when women hold a mobile phone, they're more likely to drop it and break it. And so the experience of women interacting with that as a product is very, very different than it is for men. And so you might notice that a lot of women have rings and knobs and hooks on the back of their phone. And that's actually to make it easier for them to hold it comfortably. And so you see examples, everything from, virtual reality to the new iPhone. There's examples essentially across every type of technology, the design of cities, the design of transportation, where there's a default about who is using it and how they're using it. And so what I am really interested in is the fact that if you're not the person that's been designed for, that means that every time you're interacting with this product or service or part of the city, you're experiencing pain points. And I think of all of those pain points as data. And so that means that over the course of a year, there's millions of, points of lost data because people think, oh, I'm having a problem with this experience, but no one cares. It doesn't matter, right? But all of that is data that should actually be used to drive innovation and to drive better products. And so my specific focus has been in products designed by women. Because what I really noticed was that women were taking their specific pain points and realizing that, hey, if this is a problem for me, it's a problem for millions of other women. And maybe that represents a market that hasn't been explored. And so I think our mutual friends, Mickey and Rada, created Thinks, which came out of their personal experience as women and saying, hey, the period products that we have don't work. Can we take materials that have been created for skiing and hiking that are absorbent and serve all of these functions, and refit those to function for women in a completely different way? And the reason it didn't happen 50 years ago or 30 years ago when these materials were created is there were probably no women in the room, right? Who looked at those materials and said, hey, I could use this for a period product. And so you see that, their company has gone on to be incredibly successful. There are companies like Honest Company, Zola, Glossier, and they're all kind of taking their specific pain points and using that to drive innovation. But there are even things, I think you and I were talking about this, when it comes to things like coded patriarchy, the space suits, right? Recently, they wanted to do an all-female space launch, and there wasn't equipment that was sized for women. And when it comes to COVID, we're seeing the same thing with PPE equipment, that it's also not sized for female health workers. So it's one of those pervasive problems that we don't think about design.
Right, and it's everywhere. Here's Thomas DeLauer says drug development testing revolves around men as well. Sheesh. So what's interesting about this is you would think that this wouldn't be the case. So on the one hand, we've had patriarchy for millennia, and almost exclusively throughout history, it's been it's a man's world, right? And the door thing. That's probably why back in the day it was very expected that men would hold the door open for women, right? Because I never really thought, well, part of that's because it's designed for men, but the interesting point that you bring out in your article is that shouldn't be the case, because the vast, by far the largest segment of the population who are the consumers are women. And so the almighty dollar should weigh out over entrenched patriarchy. So.
Right, which is the irony, right? That it doesn't. Women drive something like 85% of all consumer spending decisions, even for things like cars, banks, insurance, finance, electronics, that we are, for whatever reason, assume are male decisions. They're primarily taken and implemented by women. And so no matter what type of business you're in, you are in the business of selling to women. And part of the reason is that if you ask men and women, your average man, I think it's something like 60, for the stat is about 65% of men, report only buying gifts for their wife. And it's usually once or twice a year that happens. By comparison, women actually shop for not only themselves, but the whole family. And so women are buying for up to, 5 people or more. Your average woman has 2.5 children over her lifetime. So it's her children, her husband or partner, her parents, his parents, and then extended family, right? And so women's scope of influence is actually much greater than you would expect as a result of some of this behavior.
Mindset is, if you want to make a woman's product, just make it pink and charge more for it, right?
Shrink it and pink it.
Shrink it, shrink it, pink it, and charge more for it.
Yeah. No, that's been the default mindset. And what that's led to is that when we look at venture capital, 98% of all new innovation is led by men. So only 2% of venture capital goes to female innovation. And then if you look at founders of color, so women of color, it's actually 0.2% of funding goes to women of color. So there's huge disparities that are created by this assumption of default. And I think in a lot of ways, when we talk about inequality, we don't talk about how profitable it is. Right? because it does skew where resources are allocated as a result of those, types of expectations. So when we have these ideas of what is a default, or, if I ask someone, what does an investor look like? What does a tech founder look like? What does a scientist look like? The first 5 images that pop into their heads are, probably going to look very specific, but they're probably not going to look like a woman, right? And they're probably not going to look like a woman of color. And so those defaults do drive expectations and drive the types of choices people make when they're allocating capital.
Agreed. I'm going to make a last call for questions. Evan said all the funding NASA gets, and they can't make it. Oh, I should pop it up there. So, all the funding NASA gets, and they can't make more than a few suits for women. Yeah, and it goes back to the default. The default was men. I can vouch for that. And I remember. I mean, we had a recent incident, but we've been talking about this at NASA for a long time. And I remember the overarching viewpoint by the management was that's just the way it is. We've got, we haven't designed for the 99th percentile, or, as far as size goes, which is the wrong way to look at it, because it's not the 99th percentile of women.
Right.
So, and I don't quote me on the 99th percentile, but I do remember that there was a general feeling, not amongst the women, of course, that this is just the way it is, and oh well, I guess you don't get to do spacewalks.
Oh my gosh,
we don't have a suit to fit you. What do you have in mind? What do you in the remaining time that we have? Is there anything that is gnawing on you to discuss?
I mean, I think that the other thing you and I talked a little bit about recently, we were talking about, what's happening with the protests and, some of those impacts. And I think it's really interesting. One of my spiritual teachers gave a talk recently, and what he really reminded me of was that, all throughout history, there have always been people of conscience. And whenever there's injustice, they, rally together, and they kind of, come forward to help lead everyone. And I think that there's, I think so much of the narrative has been, is it black or white, or is it, and I think that it was really interesting to speak to him, because I think for me that put it, back in, the context that, again, is about unity. Like, we actually, so many of us share kind of a collective will to see a better world, and share wanting to use our time and our energy towards transforming where we are. And I think you asked me earlier what gives me hope. And I'd say that during this time, I've been incredibly hopeful in seeing so many of my friends and people in my life really step forward as allies and champions. And I know that is privileged. I know that that's not what everyone is experiencing. But I've taken a lot of hope in seeing my friends and, friends and people I know really show up in this time in a way that's been incredibly productive, and really champion what's happening and champion the voices that are out there. So that's given me an incredible amount of hope.
Good. We've discussed this before too, but I don't see it as binary. I don't think we have a population of folks with a conscience and a population of folks without a conscience. I think there's at least one more group in there. So there's certainly people that have a conscience and are, in the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, understand that we can't succeed by denying what exists, and that we have to address what exists. But I think that is part of the problem. The part of the problem is that it's not that people don't have conscience, that it's that they are ignorant that a problem exists. There are people that don't have a conscience that just don't care, and that certainly is part of it. But there's at least three groups here. There's the people with a conscience that care and are doing something about it. There's people with a conscience that, for whatever reason, and they probably have some responsibility in this as well, they're ignorant to the real root cause of the problem, and that the fact that there is even a problem. And then there's people that understand that it's a problem and just don't care. So I think that middle group is a group that we could potentially work on, and that's all about education, right? And it's but you can't educate those who refuse to be educated. You can't educate folks who refuse to listen to, at least not that I know of. And so it takes two parties for people to learn, a teacher and a learner, and there has to be listening involved. So that's a tough one. That's a tough nut to crack, because we're so entrenched right now. We're so divisive. We're so polarized that we refuse to acknowledge the merit of anything on the other side, because we've formed into sides. Because if we acknowledge merit in their point of view, we will lose and they will win. They will gain ground and we will lose ground. It's going back to duality, right? So it's not. We've oversimplified things to a dangerous level.
And maybe that's why Mother Nature or the universe put us all in timeout.
Yeah.
maybe that's why.
Yeah, but that's starting to backfire too. So I am also optimistic, but there's some bumps in the road still to go through.
No, absolutely. I think that, we're in a world that is much more complex than we like to admit. And I think just again, I go back to leadership. Like we need leadership that allows us to unify and address problems as a collective with more transparency and more unity than we've had in the past. But I think some people who are not willing to come to the table now, I think so much of that is miseducation. We've had hundreds of years of miseducation and erasure of accurate history, right? That's really been only written from kind of one default perspective, instead of reflecting the totality of what has been the human experience here. Yeah. And so, I think there's work to do, right? There's work to do in taking on the challenges that have been left to us by our parents' generation, right? The previous generations. And, this is work that they didn't take accountability for in their generations. And I think it's on us now to make sure that we're not leaving this to our children, right? That we're not leaving these challenges to our children. So hopefully we answer that call and collectively we address it now.
If I were to pick out one word that is the highlight and the important message of this conversation that we've had, I think it's default. Because even as you were speaking and you were talking about the need for leadership, and you've done such a good job of highlighting our defaults and how I call that in the book that's coming out, our entrenched starting conditions. Our default, it's just another word for default. And when you were speaking about the need for leadership, the default that popped into my head, and I'm sure popped into a lot of people's head, is, oh, she's talking about the upcoming presidential election. When I don't think that's this. I mean, I think we need to change the leadership there as well. But leadership can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to come from the government. The default is leadership comes from the government, right? And particularly the federal government in most cases. Leadership can come from anywhere. It can come through a grassroots movement. It can come through movements. It can come, there's so many different places that real altruistic servant leadership can come from. We haven't had servant leadership in a while, and I think we need that. Any words of wisdom? Any words of encouragement, or any last words you want to leave folks?
I think that this, as challenging as this great transition has felt, I think that there's a real potential for transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that in itself is hopeful. And I hope that, the fact that this opportunity has presented itself means that on some level as a collective, we're ready for this. And it feels like an opportunity for a rapid evolution, right? We're being pushed beyond our comfort zones in so many ways, right? That would have been decades or hundreds of years, right? You and I have been in so many of the same meetings at the UN and heard these conversations. How many centuries does it take to overturn, this or meet these SDGs? And we're actually being presented with the potential to transform these things really quickly. So I think we're being given a real opportunity, and I feel like you're one of the voices that I really look to in this time, because you provide a message that is missing in so many spaces. And I think you have such a unique perspective that has the opportunity to unite a lot of people and help to forge a commonality in how we make decisions, how we view each other, how we move forward. So I hope that you continue to be, part of the conversation about how we move forward as a collective.
And I'll say the same exact thing to you. And thank you for all that you're doing as well. And just one last point, because you brought up a really, really good point, is, we are going to get through this, and, all growth comes with some discomfort and some pain, and a lot of growth occurs in darkness, right? Like our minds are rejuvenated in the darkness of sleep. A seed grows in the darkness of the ground. A fetus grows in the darkness of a womb to become a beautiful sentient creature capable of, pondering infinity and the meaning of life. And so we're in a somewhat of a dark time. We're certainly in an uncomfortable time, but hopefully growth can come from that. And so, Danielle, I really, really thank you for this conversation. I think it was great. And I also want to thank you for all that you're doing to help make life on our planet as beautiful as our planet looks from space. You've done some amazing things, and I thank you for that. So.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you today. And any conversation that I can have with you, that
vice versa. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. Thanks for all the comments and questions, and tune again next week. Same channel, same time. So goodbye, everybody. See you.